I've been very dishonest with some of you because I said it's really nice to be here. And the reality is my alma mater, Penn State, is playing Ohio State at...
Sacrifice.
So... We're not going to talk about, I see there's some old timers here who may remember 1971, but we're not going to talk about that. Nobody's going to ask, okay. Right, well, thanks, John. I mean, you did such a great job. There's nothing left to say. He showed you pictures I'm going to show you. I'm actually delighted that Carmen is going to build on what we're doing here. And the really cool thing is, if any of you go on one of my tours, then you will get to give a lecture here based on your experience. At the end, I will have QR codes up for the tour in January and March, both of which we're still welcoming people. And for those who worry about is it secure and those sort of things, I'm reminded that nowhere in the world is secure. But it may be of some consolation to know that in December, my wife and I are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and we're doing a family trip to Egypt. We'll be there for Christmas, and we'll be there with my 3-year-old granddaughter, my 5-year-old grandson, my 9-year-old grandson, and my graduating senior grandson. And I would not take them anywhere where they would be endangered, I assure you.
I'll just add that at no time did we feel unsafe. Ever.
Yeah. Okay, as mentioned already, the Exodus from Egypt is probably the most important salvific event of Old Testament history. The Exodus really is the resurrection of the Old Testament, the resurrection of the Hebrew people. So it's the foundational event of Old Testament. I could spend the day just talking Old Testament theology with you, but that's not our purpose. And as was hinted at by John, there is, certainly for the last 40 years, a tremendous pushback against the historicity of the sojourn and Exodus. So I give you here Israel Finkelstein, whose book, The Bible on Earth, has sold tens of thousands of copies in multiple languages. He is Israel, the country of Israel's premier archaeologist. And he says this: the historical saga, that's a clue right away, he doesn't believe it's history, contained in the Bible from Abraham's encounter with God and his journey to Canaan to Moses' deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage, is a brilliant product of human imagination. End of quote. Bet you never saw this guy before, but maybe you have. Zahi Hawass, the man who sees himself as the world's greatest archaeologist, was quoted in the New York Times some years ago as saying, as archaeologists, we have to say that these stories of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses never happened because there is no historical evidence. End of quote. Of course, the assumption is that the Bible itself is not a reliable witness to history. And of course, that takes some assumptions. Now, often people get upset by, oh, well, this is just academic. This goes on in the ivory towers of academia. It doesn't affect us. But the conclusions of critical scholarship or minimalist scholarship, as you heard about, trickles down into places like Wikipedia. And if you read some of these statements in Wikipedia, now again, Wikipedia is constantly changing and editing and so on. Some years ago, a colleague of mine approached me and several others and saying, let's see if we can do some work that would be accepted by Wikipedia to give an alternative perspective to what they are giving. And I noticed that the editor, one of the editors that controls the whole thing about ancient Israel and so on, is a guy whose name is Shabazz. And if you don't know what Shabazz is, that's a common name with black Muslims. And so you have a black Muslim who hates Israel as being a key editor for this material. But look what they're saying. Modern archaeology has largely discarded the historicity of the patriarchs and the Exodus story, with it being reframed as constituting the Israelites' inspiring national myth narrative. The Israelites and their culture, according to the modern archaeological account, did not overtake the region by force, but instead branched out of the Canaanite peoples. In other words, the Israelites are simply a tribe of the Canaanites. And the culture, through the development of, and through that, they developed a distinct monotheistic and later monotheistic religion centered on Yahweh, get this, one of the ancient Canaanite deities. And I can tell you there's not a single text from Canaanite text, which they mean from the site of Ugarit in what is today Syria, the very southern part of Syria, just north of the border with Lebanon. This is where ancient Ugarit was, and I can assure you there's no deity there named Yahweh. And yet there it is. Okay. So how does a believer respond to this sort of criticism? Again, it's pervasive, and as you know, very often when you take a position counter to the prevailing views, you're the oddball, you're the weirdo. So the Bible's treatment of the Exodus event, it's more than just a story that's told in the early chapters of the Old Testament. It actually is treated in the Bible as a historical event. So for instance, that later events are dated from that event. Okay, so we might say something like the United States was founded in our Declaration of Independence in 1776. That's the benchmark by which we count the history of the nation. And they used the Exodus as that benchmark. So they obviously thought it to be a historical event. One of the other things I like to point out is that certainly in biblical law, that you need 2 or 3 witnesses in order for something to be considered reliable in court in ancient times. And the view held by many critics of the Bible is that the Bible needs external corroboration in order to be verified and therefore accepted. But if you look within the Bible itself, more than 200 times the sojourn and the Exodus are referred to, and they're referred to in so many different ways. I could just give you a lecture on the different ways in which the Exodus is used, but just a quick, it's rooted in their laws. So for instance, you don't mistreat the alien because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You know what it's like to be mistreated, so don't do that to others. Well, that would be totally meaningless to people who said, Egypt? What? Were we ever in Egypt? When you look at these kind of statements, you realize that it's part of the fabric of who they are as a people. In their worship, many of the Psalms, and I'm just giving you the biggies, 78, 105, 106, 136, annual holy days. Why celebrate Passover? Why celebrate Sukkot or the Feast of Booths? These are all tied to the sojourn and Exodus. And the prophets again and again keep pointing back to the Exodus as how God took Israel into a relationship with him, into a covenant relationship, and how God cared for them in the wilderness, and on it goes. Finally, in the New Testament, I like what Paul says about the Exodus event, where he says in 1 Corinthians 10, now these things happened. And because these things happened, they are appropriate to use for our instruction, for our theology, etc. Paul also makes it clear in his theology of the resurrection that if there's no historical resurrection, then we are pitiable because we've trusted in something that didn't happen. So how should the believer respond to this current climate? First of all, sorry, we're done here. I'm moving on. This book, which you may still be able to find, Do Historical Matters Matter to Faith? This was a book of essays that I organized with my colleague Dennis McGarry at Trinity, and I have an article in there called "These Things Happened: Why a Historical Exodus is Essential to Theology." But the book is filled with essays written from various perspectives: New Testament theology, church history, and it's all focused on the recognition that history is vital to the Christian faith and to the Jewish faith. The theologian Colin Brown wrote many years ago that if an event such as the Exodus is seen as a paradigm for God's care for his people, the comfort and hope that the believer is exhorted to draw from it are surely ill-founded if there's no corresponding historical base. So when the Israelites go into the Babylonian captivity, and we read this line that you in the future you will no longer say the God who brought us out of Egypt will do X, Y, and Z for us, but rather you'll say the God who brought us from Babylon will do X, Y, and Z for us. So it's like at that point the Exodus is a distant past memory, and God's actions and working on behalf of his people in the exile and the return to the land becomes the sort of the second Exodus. So the paradigm is built around the reality of the primal event, if you will. Now, I think you all know, because in apologetics we understand that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that's a very important point. Now, sometimes absence of evidence is proof of absence of something taking place, but not an automatic one. But it is an important consideration. So I would say, yes, there is no direct evidence. I cannot take you to the Cairo Museum and show you a beautiful stone inscription and say, there you go, it says, Moses led the people out of Israel and Pharaoh X pursued them. We'll never find anything like that. So what do? My approach has been, and it's twofold. Number one is to look at the external evidence that would provide the background and setting for the Bible, and that's what we'll be doing here this morning. But the other thing I try to do is saying, while we don't have proof of the sojourn of the Hebrews from Egyptian sources, what we have is embedded in the Bible elements of the narrative that only make sense if the Hebrews were in Egypt. Okay? And that's the sort of thing I think that Carmen was mentioning that you cited. I call what we're about to look at as indirect evidence. Indirect evidence, when critically and carefully considered, demonstrates the plausibility of the biblical narratives. Historians, archaeologists, when we're dealing with ancient stuff, if you don't have a living witness to something, the best case you can make is a plausibility argument. That's number one. Or, and I'm doing this in my books, my book Israel in Egypt, which has been in press since 1997 with Oxford University Press, is now going to be published in a much larger edition by another publisher, hopefully out in a year. But one of the points I try to make in that book is to use the preponderance of evidence and using that as a standard rather than without a reasonable doubt that the preponderance of the evidence points to the plausibility. So you're 51% sure, not 100% sure. And so I think taking that legal perspective is important. The other legal dimension I would embrace too is, again, counter to what the intimation was in the Wikipedia statement, is that we treat the Bible as I would treat any other ancient Near Eastern text. I don't give the Bible special favor in how I read it. Of course, as a believer, I read it and believe the Holy Spirit acts in a spiritual way with me as a reader and anyone as a reader. But we're talking about sort of the nitty-gritty of linguistics and history and that sort of thing, which is different. And so I would look at a text that lecture on dating text, for instance, coming up. That's the sort of thing I would do. And I will see that here today too. So the question then is, do the Bible and archaeology agree? Is there a wide separation between what the Bible claims and what is known from ancient Egypt that would correspond? Now, this is what I call the Blazing Saddles test. There are a couple people here who have seen Blazing Saddles. Those of you with dumbfounded looks on your face, if you like Mel Brooks kind of humor, you'll love this movie. But the reason I use this illustration, because you have a story set in the Wild West in 1874. And here is the sheriff riding along into this town where he's going to be the peacekeeper. And he's riding his horse. And then if you take a look at his saddlebags, you might see that they are Gucci's. Okay. So ask yourself, was Gucci around in 1874? And the answer is no. Gucci was founded in 1921. So right away, we look at those sort of things and we laugh. Well, the sheriff goes on and he comes to Count Basie's orchestra, and they're playing out in the middle of the desert. And we say, you know, no orchestra plays or band plays out in the middle of the desert. But there we are. There's Count Basie on the piano, and it was founded in 1935. So once again, we have what we call anachronisms, these wrong time, wrong place. And so my approach, and what we'll try to do and illustrate here a little bit, is does the Bible's description of the Hebrew sojourn, does it create these laughers, these hip-slapping moments that make us think, well, that's goofy. We know that couldn't have happened. You know, it's not like Moses drives off into Sinai in a Cadillac, which is how this movie ends, with the sheriff riding off in a Cadillac with big longhorns on the front. And again, instead of riding off on the horse into the sunset, right, he's riding off in a car. And of course, that doesn't work. It was a 1962 Cadillac, I believe. But you see, that's the sort of thing I'm saying. When we see that in an entertainment, we recognize it as a type of humor that just doesn't fit reality. And that's part of what makes it funny. So does this work when we come to the elements in the book of Exodus, especially the opening chapters? So I'm going to take a little time to look at some of this. And get my cutter. We all know about the forced labor that the Israelites were compelled to do for Pharaoh. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. So they were engaged in building projects, making bricks for building projects, and also in agriculture. Okay? And this is working for the state. So forced labor, does the picture fit? And I think the book that John was reading on the plane that I disrupted his reading, on the 5 views on the Exodus, the 5 different contributors to that book would all agree that if there's a historical Exodus, then it would have taken place roughly between 1500 and 1200 BC, somewhere in that period we call the New Kingdom. So is there evidence in the New Kingdom for the sort of things being described in the book of Exodus? As I said, brickmaking and agriculture are the 2 areas. And my thunder has been somewhat robbed, but this is one of the places we take our groups to, the tomb of the vizier or the prime minister of Egypt. Egypt had Pharaoh, and then there was an official who was basically running the country. And during the New Kingdom, there were actually 2 of them, one in the north and one in the southern part of Egypt. There were 2 viziers. So this was the vizier of southern Egypt, and he oversaw a lot of the building projects for Pharaoh at temples and other things. So this is the entrance to his tomb, and I assure you that's not him standing there. But this is. And one of the nice things that archaeology also does for us is it helps us visualize the context and the background of the story. So every vizier of Egypt going back at least to the early 3rd millennium wore this sort of white gown up to the armpits, linen gown. And so as soon as I see that, now as soon as you see that, you'll say, oh, that's a vizier. He's a prime minister. And so Joseph, I believe, was such a vizier, but at an earlier time when they only had one vizier, not two viziers. In any event, we're told that Pharaoh clothed him in linen. I don't know if we'll be able to come back to that or not. We might, depending on time. But there you go. He's the vizier, and here is the one of many technical activities that he is supervising, or not directly, but people report to him. And there's metalworking, there's furniture making, there's leather work, all these things, and including brick making. And so this is the famous brick making scene that was referred to earlier. You see water being dipped in these large vessels and carried and poured to mix with the soil to make mud, and the mud is being piled into buckets and taken over to the brick maker, and there's got a brick mold. We actually have such brick molds that have survived in a number of museums, and here they are at work. Of special interest here is that, again, it's a little hard for you to see, but this man is clearly a black African. Others, their hairstyle and so on reveals that they are from the West Semitic world, that is from Western Asia. And notice them using these yokes to carry bricks once they're done. And off to the right, they're building a ramp, a mud brick ramp, and the purpose of that is to slide the blocks up to put into place. That's how they built high walls and other structures. And notice there are foremen. Here's a foreman with a stick, giving this guy a gentle whack. Here's another one over here, sitting, watching over the workers. And again, so this is your sort of neutered picture of this, I'm sure, from the standpoint of the workers. If they were to draw this picture, you'd have these big, mean, savage guys with huge sticks and everything else. The inscription up here reports that these workers were basically prisoners of war taken from military campaigns. So they were prisoners brought to Egypt, both from Nubia, that is south of Egypt in what is today Sudan, and north into Canaan and Syria of today. So we know then that these are what we today call POWs. They were brought in, they're put into forced labor. And so in essence, the Hebrews who had been treated as green card holding aliens are now being mistreated as if they were prisoners of war, enemies of the state. I don't know why it wants to do this. I guess it's trying to tell me we should join the internet here. Now, there's a beautiful verse in Leviticus 26:3 which describes what's going on here. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. Instead of bending over like that poor black man is to lift these heavy loads and carry them around, God has taken that yoke, he's broken it, and liberated them from the bondage of Egypt. So just that verse with this picture is a wonderful correspondence. The other area I mentioned was agriculture, and where we do see foreigners at work, and this picture's not the best, but here's another one from a tomb in the maybe around 1400, tomb of Userhet. And these men are working in vineyards, and again, they're foreigners, and the reason you can tell is almost all of them have light blonde hair. Egyptians have black hair. And so you see people with different colored hair, different colored skin. Look at this one, for instance. Here's a vineyard, and you can clearly see black Africans. Here's another one. Here's a guy with a pointy beard, receding hairline, longer hair. Look at this guy with blonde hair. These are clearly non-Egyptians, and they're engaged here in the agricultural side of things. Look at these guys down here stomping the grape juice to make wine. Look at that blonde hair. Okay, these are non-Egyptians, so they're working for the state. Now there's an interesting little word that occurs in Exodus 12. Look at verses 36 and 37. It talks about the Exodus, and then we come to this statement about, and there were 600,000 men besides women and children. And then we go off on, well, how many were there? How many million were there? And we get lost in that discussion, and we miss the next word, which says, and a great multitude went up with them. An Arav in Hebrew. Who are these people? They're non-Hebrews. I believe that these were other people pressed into hard labor who had seen what had happened, who had seen God act on behalf of the Israelites and says, hey, we're joining you, and we're going to be part of you. And we read about them in the law, that God refers to the sojourners who are at Mount Sinai. Clearly, these are non-Israelites who joined in, reminding us that God's salvation was not just for a particular ethnic group, but God was using the Hebrews to draw others to himself too. Here we see agriculture again, and Egypt is a very different beast than what we have in the land of Canaan. And this point is, what you're seeing here are plows and sowing seeds. The guys are tossing seeds or bending over with a hoe and digging away. But all this is premised on the use of irrigation. In Egypt, you have to irrigate, whereas in Canaan, everything's based on rain. Okay? So in Deuteronomy 11, we have this point made. For the land that you are entering to take possession of is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and irrigated it, like a garden of vegetables. But the land that you are going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks the water by rain from heaven. And God said, this is really good deal. You don't have to do that hard work of irrigating. And they use different means of raising water up, as simple as taking water from a lower level canal up to the fields with buckets. And they had a device that we call in Arabic shaduf, which was used even into my teen and early 20 years. I would see shadufs at work in the field. But shaduf is basically a bucket on the end of a rope with a long beam and a counterweight. So you pull the thing down, dip it into the canal, and then the counterweight would help pull it up, and you'd pour that a bucket at a time into irrigating the field. That was probably the most common form of irrigation, and it was hard work. And so God is saying, this is how great it's going to be in the land where you're going. You don't have to do that kind of hard field work. It's going to be different. Now there's another statement in Psalm 81, which is very interesting, which alludes to the agricultural work they did, where God reminds Israel, I relieved your shoulder of the burden, your hands were freed from the basket. Chew on that one for a while. What basket? Okay, so we have these little statues. They're called ushabtis or shabtis, as a shorter, but depending on your economic status, you would have very beautiful, large ones like King Tut has with gold decoration on them. They can be made of wood, which is very expensive in Egypt because it was usually cedar that came from Lebanon. These are little clay ones. But these little figurines, there are over about 400 in each tomb. 365 are workers that represent each day of the year, and the rest are all supervisors. And the whole idea was that when you die and you go to the Egyptian idea of heaven, which is the realm where the god Osiris rules, you get to work in his fields. And there is actually a spell in the so-called Book of the Dead that you find sometimes on the larger statuettes where you have the whole spell. It's rather long, and so many of the small ones will just have a little portion of it. But the key thing is, the idea is that when it's your turn to work in Osiris' field on this rotating basis, you're going to heaven. You don't want to sit there and work in the field. Maybe, especially if you were an upper crust kind of person, the king or a vizier. You don't want to work. So what you do is you call on these little statues and say, go work for me today. And so the idea is these little statues go to work for you. Now, and notice what they do. I've highlighted. It says that you shall detail. He's talking to the statues. This is a magical spell. And basically you become detailed to work for the god, in yellow, making the field suitable for crops, of flooding the banks, that's the irrigation, or carrying sand from east to west. This carrying sand is a little obscure until you look on the back side of these little statues, and they have almost like a knapsack basket. And so the idea was that they would fill with a shovel or a hoe, strap it on their shoulders, and walk over to the other side of the field and dump this. And that was, again, to build up the topsoil. What happens, of course, is the edge of canals get dredged or the river leaves flood deposit, and so they're taking this material and dumping it on the fields to enrich the fields. So you can see on the back then, on the front they have these little tiny, but they're actually big wooden hoes, and on the back you have the basket. So the basket, I think, that Psalm 81 is alluding to is this practice of hauling sand or soil in the fields. And just as you'd have to do that in heaven, that seems to be what the psalmist is referring to. Again, these are the kind of details that could easily be read and just you gloss over that. When you look at this kind of material, you say, aha, that brings some visual image of what's going on here. And in my view, helps with the question of authenticity. Now, there's another thing. We do know that from about 1700 BC on, that you have a significant population of people from the West Semitic world, that is from Canaan, Syria, living in Egypt, for all sorts of different reasons. And like the Hebrews, some come during periods of drought. Some are pastoralists. They're trying to escape drought, just as the Bible stories. Abraham came to Egypt because of drought. Egypt's on a different ecosystem. It doesn't depend on the rains around the Mediterranean. It depends on the rains in Central Africa that sources the Nile, and that the Nile's flood every year overflows its banks, irrigates the fields naturally, and then the rest of the year you have to irrigate by hand. Now, the other thing, what I'd like to do is to take a look at what I would call the evidence that comes from the Bible that could only have come from Egyptian influence. Again, bear in mind, as John mentioned earlier, the prevailing view is that the period of the Babylonian captivity and beyond, the Persian period and into the Hellenistic period, is when these biblical stories are written. So I'm going to skip all this. Let's go right down. One interesting factoid is that in the book of Exodus, we have, I believe the number is at least 26 words of Egyptian origin. These are Egyptian words, and we'll look at some of them in a moment. From personal names to the paraphernalia used by the priests in the tabernacle. We'll go into some of that. Why is that significant? At the same time, there's not a single word of Persian etymology in the book of Genesis or Exodus or in the Pentateuch as a whole. So if a book is written in a certain period, you expect things from that time period, that world, to be a part of the text. You can't separate it. But what we see in Exodus is a significant number of words of Egyptian origin. By contrast, if you look at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, clearly written in the Persian period, about Persian kings, about Esther in Persia, etc., there in those three books, there are about as many Persian words in a clearly Persian period documents as there are in the book of Exodus. So if you can use the evidence to say, well, these books are written in the Persian period, look at all the Persian words here. And then you go to the book of Exodus and say, well, this is written in the Persian period. Okay, then you would expect what you see in Exodus to look something like the language and terminology you find in Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. And it's not the case. Okay, there's another thing, and I think we know it in our own culture, is that people who migrate into the country will in time update or Americanize their names to fit. Or they start taking second, third generation, begin to take English names. And we see that all the time. We have Chinese friends, and they've Americanized their Chinese names or completely taken new English names. They want to fit in, they want to assimilate. Well, the names you see on this list are all names, almost all, not entirely all of this list, are people who were in Egypt during the period of the Exodus. Either they're in the book of Exodus or they're in the book of Chronicles and part of genealogical lists that go back to the period of the Exodus. And so names like Miriam and Merari, that's from the Egyptian root mer, or Mary, which means love or beloved. And look at this one, Hur, like Ben-Hur, Hori, Har-Nefer. Now this guy's from Jeremiah's time, Pash-Hor, but you see the H-U-R here. This is the god Horus. He's the sky god. And guess where his primary area of influence was? In Egypt. Now gods have special areas of influence. Some are more national, some are more local, some are more regional. Horus is most influenced in the northeastern delta, which corresponds to the Bible's land of Goshen or the land of Ramses. So not surprising that if your people are there, they're starting to assimilate over centuries and using names that the same their friends and neighbors might be using. The name of Phineas is the son of Aaron the priest. I'll show you a picture of Phineas in a moment. But the other thing is, notice that all the asterisks I put here are all priests. They're all Levites, or I should say they're all Levites. So why are Levites, who become a priestly class, so connected to Egyptian pagan names? Kind of weird, huh? Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit later. But quickly, when they were in Egypt, there was no Sabbath. The Egyptians did not have a 7-day week. They had a 10-day week. But the week was not even 10 days, and then you get day 9 and 10 off as your weekend. It's not like you worked 7 or 8 days and then had 2. You had no predictable day off. That is, as a part of the weekly rotation. So you have 3 10-day work cycles, and that makes up a month. And 12 months, because of the lunar, you end up with 360 days. They recognized the complications that posed, because they also knew about the solar year. But what I'm getting at is, when the Israelites were in Egypt, if they had known anything about the Sabbath, we don't read about the Sabbath until Exodus 16. As soon as the people leave Egypt and they're in Sinai, God brings the manna. And it's at this point God says, all right, you go collect the manna 6 days a week. On the 7th day you rest. And you don't collect it on the 7th. And that's where he's introducing them. It's not at the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. It's as soon as they leave Egypt. So God is saying, look, you've been on their system for all these years. Now I'm going to introduce or reintroduce. Again, the Bible doesn't mention Sabbath other than in Genesis 2:4, or 2:3. So here is the first time we have Sabbath mentioned. And it's as soon as they leave Egypt. Now, what the Egyptians did was they had a lot of religious holidays. They had lots of gods, lots of religious occasions. The difference between the lunar and the solar year was 5 days, and those were 5 days of Mardi Gras, for Egypt. Partying and drunkenness and having a great time. But basically, people got religious holidays. And we know this because we have actual surviving work rosters. So workers who, one is on a papyrus or a leather scroll in the Louvre in Paris, but these have the names of people, and then if they miss a day of work, there's given a reason why they're not there. One poor chap has a scorpion bite. He's off for a couple days. Then others, they're off for a religious holiday. And so I think that when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, give my people 3 days to go worship their God, he's trying to cut the same deal that the others were getting for their gods and their time off. And so that may be a part of the background. But so it's as if God has to introduce them to the Sabbath as soon as they're outside of the clutches of Pharaoh. When we think of the golden calf, Egypt is filled with bovine deities. Texans will be very happy. This is the goddess Hathor, who is a very nice mother goddess cow, but probably not what they had in mind that Aaron made. There are a couple other bull deities, and the one on the left is the mare-were bull, the bull of Heliopolis. And the other one on the right is the Apis bull from Memphis. So they both are different manifestations of a god as a bull. Here is Ramses the Great, Ramses II, and here he is burning incense, making an offering to the bull of Atum, that is the bull from Heliopolis. So I would imagine iconographically, if you're trying to say, what did Aaron's golden calf, which I think is a mistranslation, it probably looked like one of these characters. The tabernacle. Give me a wave when you want me to, because this is an accordion lecture. We can go this way or we can go this way. So, okay.
We're all soaking it in. Keep going.
Okay. The tabernacle is one of the most fascinating objects, if you will, in the Old Testament, and all the descriptions of it and so on. But what's amazing is that so many of the technical aspects and the materials out of which the tabernacle and its furnishings are made derive from Egyptian terms and Egyptian materials. So for instance, linen, which is worn by the priest, which is part of the trappings of the covering of the tabernacle. The actual ancient Egyptian word for linen is used, which is the word shesh. That becomes important because in later biblical times, the normal word for linen is boots. And that's what we have in Ezekiel, 1 Chronicles, Esther, and we recognize that all these books are Persian period books. They're not using the older Egyptian word that you have here. The place, there's in Exodus 26, Exodus 28, in other words, in the wilderness context, you have this material, and this is just after they leave Egypt. The other place in the Old Testament where the same word is used is in the Joseph story, which is also set in Egypt. There's only one occurrence of the word shesh outside of Genesis and Exodus, and that's in the book of Proverbs, where the woman is trying to lure a man into her bed and talks about how she has this fine Egyptian linen. So Egyptian linen was the world's best, beautiful stuff. But other than that, a different word is used. So the fact that an Egyptian word is used in an Egyptian context, again, is rather telling. The furnishings, all the wood for making the tabernacle, the ark, and all these wonderful things were made of acacia. The Hebrew word is shittim, and you may have seen that word from time to time because sometimes it's treated as a location that the Israelites encamped at Shittim before they entered into the Promised Land, for instance. But that's the word. It must have meant that there were a lot of these acacia trees where they were camping. But again, the word behind the Hebrew shittah is the Egyptian word for the acacia. Now, I'm going to go over this stuff really quickly because it's very technical, but I think very cool. Egypt was the place, as you know, where they really knew how to work gold, combining it with furniture and statues. So this is from King Tut's tomb. This is a little niche, or if you will, it's a shrine made of wood but covered with gold foil, like aluminum foil, maybe a little thicker than that. On the right, you have this beautiful statue of the goddess Selkut, and it's as if it's almost like it was painted on. But the Egyptians had mastered the gold covering of wooden furnishings. And we know that the Egyptian word for this technology is the word pecha, and the Hebrew word, which you read in Exodus and Numbers, is pachi. So the technology for making this material is the Egyptian technology. I mean, I have every reason to believe that Bezalel and those who helped in making the tabernacle were people who probably did this sort of work in Egypt. They weren't necessarily all out grunting in the field, but some of them were skilled craftsmen and worked either for an Egyptian high-ranking person or on projects for the royal family, who knows. Okay, jewelry. King Tut's jewelry is very beautiful. And notice this piece. There are 3 colors of stone: turquoise, darker blue, and the orangey color stone. These are the gemstones. These are the most common gemstones you will find in Egyptian jewelry. You'll see it again here. And another one. And these breastplates that are worn by the king are about half the size of the breastplate of Aaron that's described in Exodus 28. And the number one source of turquoise during the period of Moses, during the New Kingdom, in fact, the only source, was from Sinai. And where are the Israelites when they're making this stuff? They're in Sinai. Okay, so here you see some little fragments. Years ago, when I was filming a program with the BBC in Sinai, we were greeted one morning by several women, Bedouin women. They, all black, little eye slits, and they came up and they had shawls, and they opened up their shawls before us like they opened a little craft store, and there's all kinds of trinkets and whatever. And I saw this beautiful piece of turquoise, and we were right at the site of the ancient turquoise mines. I said, "Oh, this is cool. I'm going to buy some turquoise." So I negotiated, bought it. Years later, I'm taking my wife to a jeweler in Cairo, and I'm saying, we want to turn this into a piece of jewelry, into a brooch or a chain or whatever. And I showed him this, whatever, he was the owner of the store, but they do the work, the gold work and all that. So I said, could we do this? And he looked and says, "Where'd you get this?" "Oh," I said, "I got it in Sinai. I bought it from some Bedouin women." He looked at it and laughed. He said, "This is synthetic. It's made in Germany." How did that end up in a Bedouin lady's shawl? Anyway, so turquoise was valued by the Egyptians. The dark, believe it or not, is lapis lazuli, which comes from, does anybody know? One place in the world. Close, Afghanistan. Comes from Afghanistan. And then the red is carnelian. So you notice that both pieces of jewelry I showed you have the same. And here's one. This was actually an Egyptian-like pectoral that was discovered at Byblos in what is today northern Lebanon, the town site of Tripoli. So these are the most popular things. Now, I've done an extensive linguistic study of the words of the gemstones in the priestly breastplate, and turquoise is one of them. Lapis lazuli is another, and carnelian is another. So the 3 most popular gemstones you find in Egyptian jewelry are also in the high priest breastplate. And 4 of the words, the names of the gems in the high priest breastplate, are words of Egyptian etymology. Okay. So when you put these things together, it's these kind of little details that it's not like any one thing, but it's like, you have a pound weight and you're just putting a little bit of sugar, another spoonful of sugar, and eventually the thing tips. Preponderance of evidence, and that's what I'm talking about. Tighty whities, anyone? These are King Tut's underwear, and there are dozens of these found in his tomb. And interestingly, you may remember how God doesn't want the priests, the Aaronic priests, to climb up on the altar and reveal their private parts. And so then he orders them to wear a special sort of modesty underwear. And this was a discovery I made, and linguistically, the Hebrew word is the mekneseh. That's this kind of underwear. See the word K-N-S. Okay, you see that? The Egyptian word kenes is the sexual area, the pubic area. So it looks like that this is, the Egyptian word is being used for this particular kind of underwear that would have been worn by the priest. Speaking of priests, and maybe I'll wrap it up in about 5 minutes. Is that good? We'll get to the second half. No. This is one of the scenes you'll see at Karnak Temple and other places in Luxor. And notice these priests all have their heads shaved. Notice that? It's part of the Egyptian idea of purity and sanctity. But they wore, the priests of the Aaronic priests was supposed to wear a sash around the waist. And the sash around the waist is, again, the Hebrew word and the Egyptian word are linguistically related. And you can see they have these ties, waistband, sort of like a cloth belt that they wear, and it hangs down. Other things, again, the band worn around the head is, there's a band that the priests wear around the priestly headgear, and once again, the two words are the same. Interestingly enough then, many of the Hebrew words associated with the tabernacle, and I've only given you some, there are more, the attire worn by the priests, the materials that were used, all are words of Egyptian origin. All of this then to say is, part of what I believe is that no people in the ancient world there were no atheists. There were no atheists, there were no, may have been skeptics, but everybody was a believer in something. So it's hard to believe that for 200, 300, 400 years that the Israelites just sat there saying, well, God spoke to Abraham, and now we have to wait till God speaks to Moses, and in between we're not religious. They must have had something. And from the amount of pagan Egyptian names that we see adopted by some of the Hebrews, must indicate that some of them were worshiping other gods, Egyptian gods. They were syncretistic, etc. Whatever they knew of the God of Abraham was clearly very limited. Again, bear in mind, Abraham was not handed the book of Exodus or Genesis. You know, what did his descendants really have to go on until the revelation at Sinai? So I do believe that there were priests already established that had a very Egyptian flavor to them. I wish I could get into this more deeply, but the story of Korah in number 16 is an interesting one. The word Korah, actually it's that H is a hard, it's Korah, means bald head or shaved head. Some of you are already drawing the conclusions, right? I'm not talking about the old guys who shave their heads out there. This also was the name that was given as an insulting way to Elisha. Baldy, same word. So Korah was a Levite. And what is he doing? He's challenging the new priestly order. So I think he was probably a priest, shaved head priest like the other Egyptians, and now he was being frozen out by the new order, the Aaronic priests. And so they're questioning the line of priests from Aaron, and they're saying, look, you know, there's nothing special about you, you know. And by the way, if you'll notice, when they showed up, when they showed up to contend with Aaron and Moses, they are carrying incense burners. Your average layperson doesn't have incense burners. That's what priests have. And the word for that incense burner is also derived from Egyptian word. So they were clearly Egyptianized priests. Here we go again. Now I wanted to introduce you to Phinehas. Remember, the son of Aaron is Phinehas. Here is an Egyptian priest, and his name is Panechsi, which means the Nubian or the dark-skinned one. And that's the name of Aaron's son. And this is a priest of Akhenaten during the 14th century. And notice his shaved head, and he's a priest. Now, lastly, one last thing I think is really cool is that in Numbers chapter 10 and verse 2, God commands Moses to make 2 silver trumpets. This verse almost goes unnoticed because we always think of the shofar, the ram's horn that is used in the later tradition. And it used to be thought, well, silver trumpet, that's crazy. The Egyptians, Hebrews couldn't have made silver trumpets. Lo and behold, trumpets were found in the tomb of King Tut, including a silver trumpet. So in the 14th century BC, the technology was there to make metal, and in particular silver trumpets, and these were used precisely as they were in Egyptian culture. They were used in military contexts, much like we used to in the old movies with the charge and surrender, and it was used in military context. It was used for calling assemblies. It was used for beginning of religious holidays and so on. So the next section on mythical or authentic geography will have to wait for a future date.
Yeah, all right. We can count on it.
Thank you.
I'm going to take some questions real quick. So I will have a microphone. David will also have a microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you and then let you ask the question. 2 rules real quick. First rule is please ask a question. Okay, some people will go on and on and on and on and on telling us what they think about this topic. We're all waiting for that question, and that never actually arrives. So if you need to set up your question with a little bit of commentary, then please do that. But please ask a question. Please do it as succinctly as possible, because I'm sure that other people also have questions. The second rule is that I'm the president. I get to ask the first question. All right, so I'm not going to ask a question as much as I'm going to ask you to elaborate. So in your book, and before I get to that, you state that there's no direct evidence for the Israelites or the Hebrews, but there is an abundance of evidence of the Semites
Correct.
being in Egypt, both archaeologically and both textually, and both during Joseph's time and Moses' time.
Right.
Okay? So what I'd like you to do is elaborate on 2 things from your book. One is the term Asiatic, and why that's important. And the other is, at that time in history, the time of Moses, how would you distinguish archaeology, the Israelites or the Hebrews, from the other Semites that are in Egypt?
Yeah. Brilliant. First of all, the Egyptians used terms to define other people. And some of them were broad generalizations. But the one most common for people from the West Semitic world, again, the ancient Egyptian language is in the old linguistic categories was called an Hamito-Semitic language. That's not used by linguists anymore. It's more Afro-Asiatic. So the Egyptian language is an amalgam of African with elements of the Semitic language in them. So the Egyptian language is somewhat of a hybrid language. As such, they would refer to A'amu, which Egyptologists render with this generic term Asiatics. Anyone from Western Asia, in their minds, the vast majority of them spoke a Semitic language of some sort. And many of these languages were very close cousins, like Aramaic and Hebrew and Assyrian and Babylonian and Ugaritic and Canaanite, etc. These were all part of the same language group. So they use this generic term, Asiatic. A'amu. That would be comparable to what we today will say Hispanics. Now, that person may come from Mexico, that person may come from Dominican Republic, they may come from, Puerto Rico, they may come, where do they come from? It's not designating a specific country or ethnic group, it's categorizing people by language. So when they use this term Asiatic or A'amu, it would have included the Israelites and Canaanites and all the rest. So that's why you don't have a term in Egyptian texts that distinguish people into their smaller subgroups, but rather deal with them as a collective based on a common language tradition. Okay, so that was part.
Second part was archaeologically, how do you distinguish?
Yeah, well, culturally they would be pretty much the same. Again, we're talking about poorer people. Again, don't think of the Israelites' time in Egypt that they're living in concentration camps. It's sort of easy to sort of read World War II, look back on the Israelites in that way in Egypt. Clearly, they had their own homes. How else would you put blood over the doorpost, right? If you didn't have a home to live in. And clearly, they had sheep and goats, and it's just that they had gone from being welcomed under Joseph's Pharaoh and given opportunities to work, given land to where they could graze their sheep, and now they're the men are being taken and pressed into hard labor. They weren't rounded up and put in prisons and let out to work during the day. Okay, so you got to clear up that picture. I mentioned already the mixed multitude, the non-Hebrews that would have joined in the Exodus. So clearly these would be people probably of similar ethnic stock. Again, archaeologically, it's very hard to distinguish an early Israelite home or settlement and a Canaanite, because there's more of the Canaanite elements in the Hebrew or Israelite culture than you might think. And that is what has led to some people saying, oh, the Hebrews were just Canaanites. They're using much of that. But then bear in mind, Joshua 24 says, God says, look, I'm going to give you houses that you didn't build. I'm going to give you fields you didn't grow. The Israelites did not go into the land and totally destroy it, annihilate the land, and wipe out the infrastructure, because they would have to rebuild it all. So God's saying, hey, part of the victory is you're going to have homes. And so when you move into homes that are made by Canaanites or cities it's going to look like it's Canaanite. How do you distinguish who's living there? It's not like they're running around putting Star of David on their homes at that time. So the reality is making that distinction archaeologically is very difficult. There's one interesting example, which we now have seen more commonly, is that in the southwestern part of Israel, you can go on one side of the valley, a site like Beit Shemesh, and on the other side of the valley, you have Philistine territory. And in the Philistine towns, you find pig bones. In the other side of the valley, there's no pig bones. Okay, that's clearly an ethnic marker, yet everything else, they might look very similar. So sometimes you can distinguish, but for the most part, it's very hard to distinguish.
I think one of the points that you drove home in the book, which I thought was very good, was the timing of the Mosaic Law and when it was given. After the Mosaic Law, it's easier to distinguish Israelite settlements, like you say, because there's no pig bones,
right,
and things of that nature. Before the Mosaic Law,
right? Yeah, it's true. Starting about 1200. We start seeing all these smaller towns, villages popping up, and they have the same sort of architectural plan that had not been there before. And so clearly somebody different has arrived. By the way, these were small communities, maybe several hundred people living in them. There's no evidence architecturally that you have millions of people coming in and setting up homes. Just where would they have lived? But these towns are small, and And Israel Finkelstein's argument, I think he's right on this, is that you have these houses built in a circular fashion, and you create an open space in between. And that basically what they were doing is how they set up their tent encampments. And I've actually seen this, where you have tents in a square, and in the middle you have your sheep and goats, and you have a corral made of rope and so on. And then when you get up and leave, you pack your tents and go. Well, basically, having lived that way for some time, when they come into the land of Canaan, the architectural model is to make this sort of circular or semicircular arrangement of houses with an open area. And so that seems to be evidence of a people that had lived in the desert for a couple of generations before coming into the land of Canaan. So that may be a thumbprint indicating these are Hebrews. Oh, there's one other thing too, and that's some of the buildings have a special outhouse kind of room, and it's been argued by an Orthodox Jewish archaeologist that these rooms were especially for women during their menstrual cycle to have a place to be purified, and it's something you don't find in other Canaanite architecture. So they're starting to see some of these things that say, aha, these are Israelites.
So I have a question actually, and then wait for others. So thank you, Dr. Hoffmier, for coming and joining us here. Do you see, or is there, you know that there's maybe some suppression of data and evidence that would support a biblical narrative or evidence for Israel? Do you see anything that would suggest that there is some evidence there, or there was some evidence, and there's something that would support the biblical ideas that is not coming to light or that's being destroyed? At one time there was some discussion of Iranian artifacts that were being destroyed by regimes who didn't want that to come to light. Do you see any evidence of that kind of situation occurring in the Middle East?
You mean modern activity?
Yes, or just in the past 100 years, or something that could have supported something else.
Oh, yeah.
Before they saw it.
Yeah.
Let's not bring some light.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, the Islamic Authority and the Temple Mount has done some things that they want to make it impossible for archaeologists to work in there. So all over the Temple Mount, they've put stone walkways all over the place, and they're covering the whole area with stone because they think that way they'll block any future excavations there. And of course, they were clearing out underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's a big open area, and you may have read about this some years ago, where they were taking dump trucks full of stuff and dumping it in the Kidron Valley. And when this came to the ears of Gabriel Barkai, who was an archaeologist, he created a system of taking all this material up to the Hebrew University, and they've been sifting through the stuff that the Muslim authorities had thrown out from under the Temple Mount. And they found coins, they found other things. So I don't know if they're intentionally trying to destroy evidence of the Jewish past, or they're just trying to create space for what they're trying to do. So it's hard to know exactly what the motive was, but the good news is that this has allowed us to see things that were there that otherwise might not have been seen. So sometimes the things that are done in the name of destroying something actually exposes and allows us to see things we might not otherwise have seen. Yes, sir.
Well, right at the end there, you flashed the part we're not going to get to see, which is mythical versus actual geography, which is kind of like leaving us with a cliffhanger. So I can't wait. I'm impatient. So I've got a question. Is there anything you can say to give insight on the meaning of the Red Sea and the terminology or what?
That's the third lecture in the series.
I really can't wait.
There's Israel in Egypt, there's Israel out of Egypt, and there's where is Mount Sinai and why it doesn't matter. So, what you're asking there really is a biblical question on one level, and I think most of you know, or many of you surely know, that the Hebrew reading, the two different names are used for the body of water the Hebrews pass through. Some passages in the book of Exodus is simply called the sea, Hayam, and others it's Yam Suf. And clearly the word Suf means reeds. Moses' mother made a basket and placed him among the reeds, same word, okay? Of the ancient translations, or modern translations, if you consider Martin Luther modern translation, when he did the German Bible, he actually rendered Yam Suf as Schilfmeer, sea of reeds, reed sea. Yes, I'll be lecturing next in Germany, so I'll have to bring up Luther's translation for my German audience. So what happened is the Hebrew tradition is clear. When the Bible was translated into Greek in the Septuagint in the 2nd, 3rd century BC, the Greek translators rendered Suf, Red Suf, as Red Sea. Now in English, reed and red is only a difference of an E, right? In Hebrew, it's not. So it's Suf, means reeds, and everybody here should know the word red in Hebrew. Edom, yeah, remember Esau ate the red stew and he was called Edom, red, and his descendants are the Edomites, the red ones, the red-skinned ones, or whatever. Yeah, so the Red Sea would be Yam Edom, not Yam Suf. So why did the Septuagint translators translate it as Red Sea? And by the way, most of the Western tradition translating the Bible has followed the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. There are very few modern Bibles that do. There are 2 or 3 that translate it as Reed Sea or Sea of Reeds. So that's a linguistic question. And I think what the Septuagint writers were doing is simply interpolating the text. That is, they didn't translate it. But what they did was they, I think, imposed their ideas of geography onto the text. So I don't know if that's helpful, but there is a body of water on the frontier of Egypt from Egyptian texts, and that the Egyptian word is tuf, which is where the Hebrew word suf comes from. So we actually have an Egyptian body of water between Egypt and Sinai, and it was probably there that you have the body of water called Yam Suf in the Bible. It's a lot more to unpack there, but I just don't have the time.
In one of your books, you go into detail in regard to this. You also talk about possible locations and the location you think. Which book is that?
Well, Israel and Egypt does have some. I've changed my mind by the time I got to Israel, ancient Israel and Sinai. If any of you are familiar with it's an excellent series. All your church libraries should have it. And it's the Lexham, Lexham, geographical commentary of the Bible. These are essays that deal with the geography going like the Pentateuch, the historical books, and so on. And I did the article on Yam Suf for that. So that's available through there. But yes, so I've dealt with that in
Ancient Israel and Sinai.
Ancient Israel and Sinai, yeah.
Okay. In the very back?
Yes, of course, it's one thing for modern archaeology to assert that there's not enough evidence to support stories or incidents that occurred that are written in the Bible. Has archaeology been able to definitively disprove anything that is written in the Bible?
No, one of the beautiful things about archaeology is you can disprove bad theories. And so I got into a discussion once, this is many years ago, probably 35 years ago at a conference, in which this professor was waxing on about not using the Bible for apologetic purposes, not using archaeology for apologetic purposes, trying to prove the Bible. And then I said to him in a question period, I said, well, what do you do if the scholarship that's bashing the Bible is really cruddy and wrong? Am I trying to prove the Bible, or am I trying to disprove bad scholarship? And he had a look on his face like, I'd never thought of that. And so a lot of times, especially in the more secular arena, my attack is that the defense of the Bible becomes obvious, but what I'm doing is attacking, claims that are made by scholars that, well, there's no evidence of X, no evidence of Y. And I say, yeah, there is. There's this, this, and this. So in a sense, I'm shooting down a bad theory. So in a sense, archaeology can be used to shoot down wrong theories. But your question about does it ever prove anything against the Bible, and I would say if you were to go to your average university in this country, among non-believing scholars, they would say, yeah, again and again, archaeology disproves the Bible. Or the absence of archaeological evidence, which of course is a non sequitur. But yes, I know it used to be said by people like Albright and other early, I've never found a discovery that contradicted the Bible. But there are certainly issues, and that's why our work doesn't end, because sometimes my simple line is that the Bible properly understood and the archaeological data properly understood does not conflict. So part of the problem could be misinterpreting the biblical data, misinterpreting the archaeological data, but I rather approach the way from saying, if we got it right on both sides, it squares nicely. So I would say, from my standpoint, there's nothing that's really disproven the Bible. However, there are those who are, obviously the polemicists against the Bible who are quite convinced, and obviously they have a following because that's what you saw on the Wikipedia line. So, and people can point to certain things and see that as a big problem, and I can counter it by saying, well, I don't see that as a problem. You have to for instance, well, the Exodus couldn't have taken place because surely there are not 3 or 4 million people running around the desert. And I would say, well, let's go and look at what does the Bible actually say, not what our English translations say. And if you have a translation of Exodus 12, 37, 38 there, and you read 600,000 men plus women and children, some cases the translations will write out 60000. But the Hebrews didn't use numerals. They wrote it out like you're writing a check. SIXHUN, they write it out. And on that particular issue, I'd say, well, what does the word Eleph mean, which is translated 1,000, and it does mean 1,000. But it has 2 other meanings in the Bible. It's a word for a clan. Gideon says, my Eleph is the weakest in Israel, my clan or my family, my extended family. It's also used in military contexts, where Jesse says to his son David, when you go to the battlefield, take this food to your brothers and give this cheese to the commander of their Eleph. Same word. It's a military unit. So is the 600 Eleph saying 600,000 men and women and children, or is it 600,000 soldiers, units of soldiers, which would be a totally different number? And so part of it is how do you interpret that word Eleph? And so you build a case against the Bible based on a wrong reading of the Bible. So I would say, well, I think you've got this wrong. Let's go back and look at it. Yes, sir.
I don't actually have a question. I just have some information for you.
No, don't give me the score.
No? You don't want it?
No, I'm recording.
Very good news.
Well, you think I'm cheering for Ohio State?
Anybody else have a question? Yes, okay.
I have a quickie. What was the golden calf mistranslated as? You said
no, it's often translated as calf. The word is egel, and it's feminine. But the word, it's the same word, I believe, that Abraham when he made the covenant with God in Genesis 15. I believe it's the same word, egel there, egelet, I believe, speaking off the top of my head. But it says 3 years old. So that seems to be the distinction between a full-grown, so you're full-grown but not fully matured at age 3. Maybe there's some cowboys here who know better than me on this. But the very fact that it mentions 3 years old, it wasn't just a couple-month-old calf. So I think when you see golden calf, you think this little tiny spindly-legged thing, whereas it's more a virile young
Still
bull.
cow.
Bovine.
Still bovine.
So it sounds like you spent a lot of time in Egypt, and I'm curious about your colleagues and friends that you have there, and if the subject of Israel in Egypt comes up sort of in conversations or by the side or wherever they hear about your work. Maybe what is kind of the attitude about Israel in Egypt among Egyptians? And also, I think I heard you say y'all earlier, so I was wondering.
Well,
from Texas, and I'm curious how you ended up in Egypt.
I'm much more inclined to use y'all than in Lancaster County they say yous for plural second person, and I always thought a ewe is a female sheep, and so yeah, this is the trip in January, and I'll answer your question. I'm sorry, I just realized I said I would put this up, so this is the standard tour, which gives you a general introduction to ancient Egypt. Okay, so if anyone is interested, there's the QR code. Politics is something I try to avoid, as I do even in America now. I'm surprised over here how, well, I shouldn't say surprised, that people who have such strong opinions are ignorant about so many things. In Egypt, it's a very difficult thing for the Christians. And think of Egypt as a country of about 110 million people, of which 10 to 15% are Christians. But they are sometimes seen as, the Christians feel sometimes they have to distance themselves from Israel because they feel that they could be seen as collaborators with the West in their support for the Zionist state. So there's that. In my dealings with, and I have very good Muslim friends, and you know, if they ever bring something up like this, or in my travels, I just say, I pray for the peace of the Middle East. I want peace. I want peace for the Palestinians. I want peace for the Egyptians. I want peace for the Israelis. This is my hope. This is my prayer. And usually that's the end of the discussion.
You pointed out you being in Egypt a lot. You were born in Egypt and raised in Egypt, right?
I had nothing to do with it.
Any other questions before we close it out? Okay, so
There's the other tour if anybody wants to.
Excellent. So one thing I was going to get you to elaborate on, and
It was a great question.
It was a great point. Oh yes, I remember. So I think this is a great thing to close on in regard to archaeology. Kitchen makes this point in his book, and I think you do as well in one of your books. And is when it comes to archaeology, when you're excavating a site, you may only excavate 5% of that site, maybe 10% of that site. And so there's a vast amount of archaeological data that's still buried, and it makes it hard to make sweeping generalizations.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, archaeological work is, you always have to see it's provisional. What you think one season, and you're developing your thesis, then next season you find something that says, well, there goes that idea. It was nice while it lasted. And so the most important thing is you can't cling too tightly to your interpretations, and you have to be humble enough to say, well, based on the evidence I saw back then, I thought X, but as more evidence has come to light, I now think Y. And so I learned not to get, the only thing I'm married to is my wife. Everything else I hold very loosely because new evidence changes things. And that's the way I think scientific inquiry should be. That's part of being honest. And people who cling to their old theories just because that's all they know, I think are not being intellectually honest. But yes, obviously some places have been dug for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet there's still more to do. Again, the other thing you have to remember is what has survived probably represents a relatively small percentage of what was. And what was, of course, we'll never know. So that's why we always have to say we're dealing with limited data, either because not enough excavations have taken place, or so much material has been lost and damaged, or is sitting in some private collection somewhere and nobody knows about an inscription. And until somebody dies and they clear the place out and they find a clay tablet that was sitting in somebody's dresser drawer for years. I've had Assyriologist friends who that's happened to them, where somebody, grandson of so-and-so was going through grandpa's stuff, and he collected this in his travels in Iraq in the 1930s or whatever, and here's this clay tablet nobody's ever known about. And so there's stuff sitting around like that. There are things that are discovered in museums. My old friend Donald Wiseman, who indeed was a wise man, he was on the original NIV translation committee. But Donald was an Assyriologist and a biblical scholar, and he worked in the British Museum in London. And he said that when he first came as a young curator, he ended up being at the University of London for most of his career, not in the museum, but he was in the museum. He says when he got there, they had these drawers and drawers of tablets, clay tablets from Babylon, Assyria, etc. And he said there were 80,000 waiting to be studied. And he says, when I left, I don't know how many years later, he says there were over 100,000. More had come in. And so obviously, when curators are going through and looking there, a lot of these are just business records, receipts, not a lot of repetition. But every now and then you fall on something like, whoa. And so he was telling me that he was going through these drawers. This would have been back in the 1950s. He looked at a tablet and he read it, and it was Nebuchadnezzar's chronicle saying, dating 587 and the siege of Jerusalem. And he found then several others that belonged to similar type, and he published all these. They're called the Babylonian Chronicle. But again, they had been sitting there for decades, along with other tablets, until someone came along and realized what they were. So some archaeology is to be done in museums, some is to be done in the field, some is to be done in your basement or attic.
Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much.